I want you to stop for a moment and ask yourself a question. What if at this very moment, someone you cannot stop thinking about has just made a life-changing decision about you? What if the silence you've been experiencing is not the absence of movement, but the sign of something powerful unfolding behind the scenes? Most people assume that the biggest changes in life arrive with obvious signs and dramatic announcements. But the truth is far more mysterious. The absolute most important permanent decisions in a human timeline are almost always meticulously forged in complete, deafening silence. They actively happen deep within the pitch-black hidden chambers of the human psyche, entirely out of public view. They occur in the exact, volatile coordinates where primal fears violently battle starving desires, where toxic doubts are forcefully confronted by undeniable truths, and where the ancient soul finally, aggressively chooses a sovereign direction it can absolutely no longer successfully avoid. Right now, at this very second, there is a massive tectonic shift actively taking place inside their unhealed architecture that your physical eyes absolutely cannot see. A deeply hidden realization, a brutal emotional breakthrough, a profound moment of psychological clarity so incredibly powerful that it actively, permanently changes the entire trajectory of two completely separate lives forever. The specific individual energetically connected to your frequencies has finally reached a critical breaking threshold where psychological denial is absolutely no longer mathematically possible. They have reached the exact coordinate where their paralyzing uncertainty has entirely lost its toxic grip, and where a massive, undeniable choice has violently emerged from the deepest, darkest marrow of their being. And you must deeply understand this reality. Once such a profound, soul-level choice is actively made, absolutely everything in the physical realm begins to rapidly, irreversibly change. You must pay incredibly close, clinical attention to this dynamic, because exactly what you are about to fully understand will flawlessly explain precisely why absolutely nothing in this connection will ever be the same again. A deep, structural inner decision is entirely unlike the cheap, superficial choices human beings casually make every single day. It is absolutely not the flimsy result of a fleeting emotion, a temporary biological desire, or a passing moment of shallow excitement. It is painstakingly born in the heavily guarded, hidden vaults of the unconscious mind, where decades of unhealed experiences, repressed emotions, vivid memories, terrifying fears, and unmet desires slowly, violently interact over a massive expanse of chronological time. Long before a fragile human being ever becomes consciously, logically aware that such a massive decision has been finalized, something fundamental is already structurally mutating within their core. The ancient, unconscious mind aggressively begins gathering scattered fragments of truth, flawlessly connecting previously invisible patterns, and violently revealing stark realities that were entirely ignored, suppressed, or purposefully misunderstood by their terrified ego. Exactly what appears to the outside world as a sudden, shocking, impulsive realization is almost always the final, explosive stage of a silent, grueling process that has been relentlessly developing directly beneath the performative surface for agonizing months, or perhaps even years. When it comes to a profound, soul-level connection, this specific inner decision is exponentially more powerful because it violently emerges from a place significantly deeper than cold logic could ever possibly reach. A deeply guarded individual may spend a massive amount of chronological time aggressively attempting to logically explain their heavy feelings away. They may desperately tell their reflection in the mirror that the intense connection is completely impractical, logistically inconvenient, or mathematically impossible. They may frantically focus all their mental energy on physical circumstances, geographical distance, terrible timing, or the heavy scar tissue of their past disappointments. Yet, completely, despite all of these highly rational, meticulously crafted arguments, the massive emotional truth stubbornly remains violently alive directly beneath the surface of their awareness. The infinitely harder they aggressively try to forcefully suppress the feeling, the infinitely more persistent, heavy, and suffocating it permanently becomes. Eventually, the brutal, agonizing psychological tension, completely, between what they consciously, logically believe and exactly what they unconsciously, viscerally feel becomes mathematically impossible for their nervous system to successfully ignore. This is exactly the precise coordinate where true, irreversible transformation violently begins. The individual suddenly starts acutely noticing highly specific signs and synchronicities they previously blindly overlooked. They begin obsessively reflecting on tiny, microscopic moments that once seemed entirely mathematically insignificant. Mundane conversations, fleeting memories, subtle emotional shifts, and brief physical encounters suddenly acquire massive, earth-shattering new meaning. The intense, magnetic connection that was once aggressively pushed aside and locked in the basement of their mind starts violently demanding their absolute, undivided attention. Instead of cowardly running from their profound feelings, they gradually, painfully begin turning around and confronting them. This internal confrontation is absolutely not a comfortable, peaceful process. In clinical reality, it incredibly often violently forces a human being to stare directly into the eyes of their absolute greatest, most paralyzing fears. The primal fear of crushing rejection, the terrifying fear of raw vulnerability, the deep fear of permanent change, and the suffocating fear of completely losing their carefully curated control all violently rise to the absolute surface of their conscious mind during this brutal process. However, absolutely every single fear that aggressively emerges also simultaneously presents a massive, undeniable opportunity for structural psychological growth. As the heavily guarded individual meticulously examines these terrifying fears, they begin deeply recognizing exactly which ancient beliefs are actively serving their soul and exactly which toxic beliefs are aggressively limiting their potential. Old, heavily fortified emotional defenses actively start weakening and crumbling into dust. The thick, iron protective walls that once felt entirely necessary for their baseline survival begin to clearly appear significantly more like suffocating obstacles than actual safeguards. The person brutally realizes that actively avoiding the truth of your connection has absolutely not brought them a single ounce of genuine peace. It has only agonizingly prolonged an exhausting internal psychological warfare. This stark, brutal realization perfectly creates the exact conditions for a profound, permanent internal shift. The massive inner decision physically occurs the exact millisecond the human soul becomes undeniably stronger than the ego's toxic resistance. At this specific point, the individual absolutely no longer needs constant external proof or shallow reassurance. They permanently stop fiercely arguing with their own reflection. They completely stop frantically searching the environment for cheap reasons to loudly deny exactly what they physically feel in their chest. Instead, they finally, beautifully reach a profound state of radical acceptance. This specific acceptance absolutely does not mean every single logical question has been perfectly answered, or that every physical obstacle has miraculously disappeared into the ether. It simply, powerfully means they have finally acknowledged a massive, undeniable truth that can absolutely no longer be hidden in the dark. The exhausting, bloody struggle completely between the terrified mind and the ancient heart begins to rapidly dissolve, and an entirely new, unshakable sense of clarity violently emerges from the wreckage. Exactly what makes this specific decision so monumental is that it permanently changes the entire direction of a person's vital energy. Their intrusive thoughts, their baseline emotions, and their deepest intentions actively start powerfully moving toward profound alignment rather than chaotic contradiction. Even if visible, outward actions in the physical realm take additional time to finally appear, the massive internal foundation has already structurally shifted. The individual is absolutely no longer standing paralyzed at a dark crossroads, frantically wondering which safe path to carefully choose. Deep within the core of their being, the absolute choice has already been irrevocably made, and from that exact, precise moment forward, their entire journey begins unfolding in a completely, fundamentally different way. The permanent end of this inner conflict is undeniably one of the most significant, life-altering psychological shifts a human being can ever possibly experience. For a massive, agonizing period of time, an individual may physically feel as though they are being violently pulled apart in entirely opposite directions by competing thoughts, heavy emotions, and starving desires. One fragmented part of their psyche desperately longs to move powerfully forward, completely embrace their profound feelings, and beautifully accept exactly what their heart already inherently knows to be true. The opposing, traumatized part aggressively resists, violently manufacturing toxic doubts, primal fears, and endless, exhausting questions. This internal psychological tug-of-war can easily continue for agonizing months or even grueling years quietly, completely consuming their vital emotional energy and actively creating a massive sense of suffocating restlessness that is entirely difficult to logically explain. In a profound soul-level connection, this specific conflict almost always becomes especially intense, precisely because the massive emotions involved actively penetrate vastly deeper layers of the unconscious psyche than ordinary dynamics ever could. Such an incredibly rare connection possesses a terrifying way of violently dragging deeply hidden fears, completely unresolved childhood wounds, and highly toxic, unconscious patterns directly to the surface of their waking reality. A human being may genuinely, powerfully feel magnetically drawn towards your frequency while simultaneously feeling utterly terrified of exactly what that deep attraction could permanently mean for their carefully curated identity. They may desperately desire profound closeness, but be entirely paralyzed by the sheer terror of raw vulnerability. They may vividly, obsessively dream about a beautiful future together, while aggressively convincing their logical brain that such a magnificent future is completely, statistically unrealistic. The fragile, terrified human mind almost always plays the central destructive role in actively maintaining this chaotic conflict. It constantly, desperately seeks ironclad certainty, absolute mathematical control, and complete protection from any potential future pain. Whenever massive, profound emotions naturally arise, the panicked mind instantly begins aggressively generating cheap explanations and logical objections. It hyper-analyzes every single microscopic detail, aggressively questions every pure feeling, and frantically searches for any possible reason why those profound emotions should be entirely ignored. This toxic process can easily create an endless, suffocating cycle of severe overthinking. Yet, the infinitely more they desperately analyze the data, the vastly more confused and paralyzed they inevitably become. Meanwhile, the vastly deeper, sovereign self relentlessly continues sending massive, undeniable signals that something incredibly important violently requires their attention. Highly specific thoughts stubbornly return repeatedly. Particular, tiny memories completely refuse to fade and remain vividly electric despite the massive passage of time. Their visceral emotional reactions consistently seem infinitely stronger than cold logic can possibly justify. The profound connection completely refuses to disappear into the background, no matter exactly how many desperate attempts are made to aggressively dismiss it. These recurring, haunting experiences gradually, systematically destroy the toxic illusion that their internal conflict can be magically solved through cowardice and avoidance. The unconscious mind functions exactly like an invisible, massive current deep beneath the surface of the ocean, quietly, relentlessly influencing the absolute direction of all thoughts, feelings, and choices completely without constantly revealing its heavy presence. In matters of profound, life-altering emotional connection, the undeniable influence of the unconscious becomes especially terrifyingly significant. The unconscious communicates its absolute truth in incredibly subtle, undeniable ways. Rather than speaking through direct, logical statements, it violently expresses itself through recurring intrusive thoughts, highly vivid, emotionally charged dreams, sudden, visceral somatic reactions, unexplainable physical intuition, and persistent, heavy feelings that completely refuse to disappear. A person may repeatedly think about your specific face, despite aggressively attempting to force their focus entirely elsewhere. This specific persistence is absolutely not an accident. The unconscious mind violently seeks profound psychological balance and structural wholeness. Whenever massively important, authentic emotions are forcefully suppressed by the ego, they absolutely do not magically disappear. Instead, they remain highly active and radioactive directly beneath the surface of awareness, aggressively influencing behavior in highly indirect, chaotic ways. a person may suddenly find themselves constantly, unfairly comparing absolutely everyone else they meet directly to someone they entirely cannot forget. As this beautiful, brutal process unfolds, hidden fears also actively begin surfacing into the light. Fear of agonizing abandonment, fear of crushing rejection, fear of suffocating intimacy, and fear of permanent change all violently become entirely visible. Although this exposure feels incredibly physically uncomfortable, it serves a massive vital psychological purpose. What stubbornly remains hidden in the dark absolutely continues exerting highly toxic influence, while exactly what becomes completely conscious can finally be understood, healed, and beautifully transformed. A monumental shift in a human destiny absolutely does not usually arrive as a highly dramatic external event that instantly changes everything in a single afternoon. Vastly more often, it organically begins as a subtle, unstoppable movement, directly within the absolute depths of the psyche where old, toxic patterns finally begin losing their heavy influence, and entirely new, magnificent possibilities begin taking physical shape. The heavily guarded individual is absolutely no longer being blindly guided solely by outdated habits, cheap expectations, or toxic external pressures. Instead, they actively start responding to a profound, deeper inner calling. Their core priorities begin aggressively changing. Things that once seemed incredibly important suddenly lose absolutely all of their significance, while profound matters directly connected to absolute emotional truth, vulnerability, and personal growth violently become their primary driving focus. The fundamental direction of their entire life starts heavily adjusting in direct response to this massive new awareness. The shift in destiny is absolutely not merely about eventually reaching a highly specific, predetermined physical outcome. It is entirely, fundamentally about finally becoming the exact sovereign person capable of bravely walking a completely different path. One beautifully shaped by massive consciousness, raw emotional honesty, and a profound, growing willingness to blindly follow the undeniable direction explicitly revealed by the deepest, most ancient currents of the human soul. Irreversible momentum is exactly the stage where an inner psychological transformation has progressed so incredibly far that completely returning to old, safe, toxic of thinking, feeling, and behaving becomes entirely mathematically impossible. The deeper, ancient truth has successfully become infinitely stronger than the fragile resistance constantly surrounding it. Even when their terrified ego desperately attempts to return to old, safe assumptions, those cheap assumptions absolutely no longer feel remotely convincing. The panicked mind may frantically revisit highly familiar logical arguments, but the ancient heart deeply recognizes that something magnificent, structural, and permanent has already irreversibly changed. The individual has finally crossed a massive, profound psychological threshold where authentic growth is absolutely no longer a distant possibility being casually considered, but a violent, beautiful reality already actively in motion, relentlessly carrying them toward greater authenticity, unshakable awareness, and perfect alignment with the absolute truths they have finally, beautifully chosen to fully embrace. If this profound breakdown provided the exact validation your intuition has been fiercely seeking in the dark, I want you to go down to the comments right now and explicitly declare your sovereignty. Type, "I anchor myself in absolute truth." Claim that unshakable, pristine energy entirely for your own resilient spirit. Then please click the video appearing right here on your screen. It perfectly reveals the exact psychological boundaries you must establish to permanently protect your sovereign peace, stay grounded, honor your worth, and keep moving forward.